Hello and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe with me, Tom Sherrington, and my partner, Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Hello, Tom. How are you?
Very good. We've both been a bit COVID-y this last couple of weeks, haven't we? But on the mend. And we're delighted to welcome today in the house the one and only Suchmo83, Christopher Such. Hello, Christopher.
Hi, thanks for having me on. Yeah, delighted to be here.
Yeah, so do I have to explain the Suchmo83? That is your Twitter handle, and that is how I first came across you, and I always remember it. Like, I don't remember everyone else's, but it just really captures the spirit of Twitter and the kind of thing. And so people who are listening in, Chris is a really sort of hot person in England in terms of talking about reading and curriculum and primary thinking, and it's just someone I think is in demand at the moment because you've just got so many kind of things to talk about, and it's really exciting. But just so people who don't know kind of your background a little bit, Chris, tell people what you're doing and where you're working and stuff.
Yeah, so currently I've just recently started working for Ambition Institute, which are a teacher trainer that work nationally across England. Prior to that, I spent nearly 16 years working in primary education, as very briefly as a teaching assistant, but also the vast majority of that time spent as a classroom teacher and as a school leader and a curriculum leader, most recently at a school of 850 children. I've also worked with initial teacher training providers and schools and multi-academy trusts, trying to help them with professional development relating to evidence-informed reading. Yeah, I think that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Wow. So yeah, I like that you put that in there, evidence-informed reading, which is a really nice sort of in there. So and we're really pleased that the fact you two did a double act for our most recent walkthroughs issue, which I'm going to flag up now. Look, there it is. It's hot off the press. I have a green copy. You two have one in the post. So if you haven't got yours yet, it's on its way. And you're kind of back to back because Emma, you did a sort of like a kind of summary of kind of key things to do with writing, and Chris, you did yours about the reading. And it's interesting how, as a secondary specialist, how little, until I started visiting schools doing my training work, how little I really knew about all of that. And yet it's something we still need to be doing in secondary, but we kind of think, oh yeah, primary do that, and then we'll teach them subjects. It's crazy, isn't it? So in your work as a primary leader, and then have you found that bridge to secondary something which you've fretted over and has been a challenge? Massively
so. It helps to an extent that my older sister is a secondary special educational needs coordinator. So she's responsible, for those who are not familiar with that term from an American audience, she's responsible for supporting those children who have special educational needs and disabilities. And so I know a bit about what happens for a lot of children when they go to secondary school in terms of reading. And the bottom line is that often not much happens. If they are not fluent, confident readers by the time they arrive, then the support often isn't there in the way that it should be. So yeah, it's certainly something that I worry about. It's tempting as a secondary teacher from conversations I've had with people to say, as you mentioned, well, primary should have done that. And there's an element of truth in that, and I get that. But equally, we have primary teachers who will pass that onus of responsibility onto others and say, well, if parents aren't doing that for us or really contributing to that, then what chance do we have with reading? And I think at every stage of education, it's essential that whether it's secondary, primary, or anywhere else, that we take that onus of responsibility upon ourselves. So yeah, in short, the answer to your question is, yeah, I do worry about that transition because it's particularly difficult.
See, I am coming from the same point as you, Chris, as in from primary, and Tom sort of mentioned the fact that there's a potential disconnect or not a transferable practice between primary and secondary. But I just wanted to say that this book I have recommended absolutely everybody that I come across, that I work with in primary, because reading can be a little bit kind of ephemeral and a bit kind of, no, I don't mean woolly because it's not woolly, but there are so many parts to it, so many contributory factors that that the information around the teaching of early reading and primary reading has been in so many different places. And I just feel like in this book, you have grabbed every single little tiny bit, woven it all together, packaged it up and went, there you go. And it's an absolute complete gift to not only to secondary, but to definitely to primary, because the richness of how you explain how to teach reading, it makes complete sense, but it's drawn in from all of these different parts. And I cannot recommend highly enough to anybody who's involved in the teaching of reading, be it primary or secondary, how much they need to read this book. So I kind of
just so people listening, the art and science of teaching primary reading.
Yeah,
and
I love the title as well, because it was kind of seen as a bit of a thing that just happens by magic, almost like an art of it. But then the science behind it is so rich, and I kind of wanted to ask, how on earth did you go about pulling together all of those elements to make this book?
That's a tough question to answer, but I think effectively it is if there is a strength to the book, it's that I don't think it's a book that could have been written by someone who didn't have extensive classroom experience, which is where the art comes in, because there is this incredible wealth of research evidence relating to reading. It dwarfs other subjects, and trying to recognize what parts of that are relevant and what parts of that to prioritize, where you can simplify, where you can't simplify, what the active ingredients of different bits and pieces are, is, I hope, what made the book work. I mean, alongside that though, in some ways I can't claim much credit. I don't think there's a huge amount of originality in the book whatsoever, because as you say, I am trying to say, oh, this is interesting, and this is interesting, and this is interesting, and connect it all together. Ironically, the only bit that I really think of as mine and having a sense of creativity links to the title, this central metaphor that runs through the book of seeing reading as more akin to a pointillist painting than compared to the broad brushstrokes that we otherwise see it. This idea of accumulation of understanding relating to words, texts, and the wider world. And yet, people have been very nice about the book, but not one person has mentioned this metaphor or the way that it ties in with the title. So if people like the book, it's not because of the creative bits that I did. They like it because there's this wealth of evidence that I hope it's more of a translation than anything creative, I like to think.
That's so important, and that is why it's so good, because there's a lot of, so for example, there's a lot of sort of discourse about phonics and so on, and you still have every so often there's another article where someone else will be saying, and the phonics debate gets round, and because people are reacting against a kind of imposition of a particular government approach and so on, so people conflate that with whether we're debating phonics per se, etc. But you make it, I just thought that it made more sense to me than ever before, plus hearing you give a masterclass on it, about how, for example, a child initially kind of learns to combine the sounds to form a word, but then after a few loops, it sort of becomes a sight word. So you can give the impression of recognizing the word as a sight word, even though its origins were in phonics. And then people don't necessarily notice that that point. So they're sort of mistakenly thinking that the child can just remember the words, but they didn't start that way. And to me, I just thought how those two ideas connect. And it's sort of, I get that, it's so obvious that you can't just rely on the sight word, because that's not where it starts. That's where what it becomes. And then phrases and everything, like the whole thing I think that metaphor is brilliant, because it's exactly that, isn't it? Gradually deepening the depth. I think it's an excellent metaphor, and let's pick it up more, because it's really good.
I think the point you make there about this, the way in which we can be deceived by what expertise feels like I think this is a wider point that doesn't just apply to reading or even just to phonics. But I think it's I like to think it's well spotted in phonics, though I wasn't the first to notice it, of course, because it does feel when we're reading like we are just flowing through text. So this is where a lot of, presumably, the whole language basis was developed in the kind of 60s and 70s, this idea that we don't, as expert readers, we don't feel like we are dealing with words in the way that we teach novices to deal with words. So we should try and skip them ahead to this expert stage where effectively we're dealing with text and dealing with words as whole things rather than analyzing them as we go. I mean, I think perhaps a slightly, if you'll forgive another metaphor, it's a bit like, you know, when you first learn to drive, if you're using manual gearbox or stick shift, I imagine it's called in America, if you're learning to drive with that, once you've learned how to do that, you don't think of it as like, okay, I need to work the clutch and find the bite point and get it into first gear and get it into second. It just becomes automatic. But if a driving instructor said to you, no, I don't want you to think about how you change gear because that's not what experts do, then that wouldn't be good instruction. You have to think about it in order to get to the point where you don't have to think about it anymore. So I think that's, you know, like I say, I think that's writ large across education, but I definitely think that's the case with the development of a sight word lexicon through orthographic mapping, which is described in the book.
The really quick way to debunk that a little bit is, I remember doing a staff meeting, I think it was around 2006, when the whole synthetic phonics thing, and I basically put the whole slide up, because my family are Estonian speakers. I basically put the whole slide up in Estonian and went, right, well, let's read this then. And they hadn't got the whole word strategies because they don't know the language. They don't recognise that. So they had to default to decode, you know, to decoding in another way. So it kind of links into, there's a thing that you say on page 126 about there is no shortcut to reading. And that was the bit that jumped out about this book. It's about there is no shortcut to reading, whether that be through kind of jumping quickly through the phonics hoops, or whether it's through that development of comprehension and the ability to infer and deduce. So I just wanted to ask you, when you started to put the book together, was that as long a process in terms of there is no shortcut to writing this in the same no shortcut to reading?
It depends what we mean by the writing process, because in the end, I wrote it as a favour to myself. I wrote it before I even suggested giving it to like a publisher. I wrote it for me, as I needed to dump all of the stuff that I'd read and organise all of the stuff that I'd read over the preceding 3 or 4 years somewhere. I just needed to have a repository for it, so I didn't, because it was kind of in my head. And it was in various Google Docs and various Word documents, but it wasn't organized. So in terms of preparing to read the book, if you're talking about like the unintentional preparation of reading around, then it was 3 or 4 years. In reality, once I had all that stuff there and I thought, okay, go on then, I am going to write something, there was a week of organizing all my notes into sections, and then into chapters, and then into individual kind of bullet points for every paragraph inside every chapter. That took a week of planning, and then there was 4 weeks. This was during the summer holiday, so it was full time. 4 weeks of writing and proofreading, and it was done. I did it just in one big chunk, a summer and a half, like a year and a half ago.
That sounds like, I like that. I respect the methodological approach there, because it's a bit like how I do my stuff, and it sort of helps you. It sounds very familiar, and I think it sort of comes through in the way you explain things when you do your presentations. There's a kind of precision there, and this is where I feel like you've helped me move people along, because as a secondary specialist, like I said, it's become sort of a bit like we don't need to know this stuff, but of course then how do you do it? And teachers in secondary aren't even trained really. Well, they may be now here and there, but it's not common to even how to run the room to do reading. And so, as well as a kind of the theoretical underpinning, which gives you that context, a couple of times recently in blogs and in talks, I've heard you talk about some of the techniques, and this whole thing about the key thing, the main thing is fluency and reading speed, and getting students to just get more fluent with knowledge, so words they already know, but just reading them more fluently. And this idea of, so I think Alex Quigley in his walkthrough in volume 2, he calls it echo reading, and you call it oral reading. Is that right? So I want you to explain this to people, this
Yeah,
idea
sure.
of sort of reading back something they've heard.
Yeah, so there's in terms of the development of fluency, there's a lot to suggest that there's this reciprocal relationship between comprehension and fluency, and that the more we comprehend, the more fluently we can read, and yet also the more fluently we can read, the more cognitive resources are freed up for us to comprehend. So there's this like I say, lovely reciprocal relationship, and you can work on both sides of that. And there's a decent body of evidence to suggest that you can target fluency itself directly. And there are a number of ways that you can look at that. So one example of this is echo reading, in which an expert, usually an adult or a researcher, in the case of the research, will read a sentence or a couple of sentences, and then the participants will read it back. And it's particularly effective in small groups and interventions where the research has been done, because you can keep track of the fact that when the children are reading back to you, they're actually tracking the words in time. They're not just echo speaking. How this works in a whole class situation, I don't know. The research isn't necessarily there for that. So that's kind of echo reading, though I think there's definitely some value to it. There's also research that suggests repeated oral reading is valuable for the development of fluency. The way that works is it's as simple as it sounds. It's the process of a child or any person learning to read, reading a text 2 or 3 or 4 times, each time aiming for a greater level of reading fluency. And it seems to be the case that this is more successful when this has been modeled first by an adult. It's certainly more successful when there's some goal setting as well. So we're aiming for something, some kind of performance at the end of the session. I'd highly recommend checking out the work of Tim Rosinski in that area. So that's so echo reading and repeated oral reading are those. There's also this idea of choral reading, where you basically get everyone to read together. Now, I think there are ways to structure reading lessons that take advantage on some level of all of those different aspects and bring them together. The challenge is how you organize that logistically in a given classroom and in a given context. And if I may say one more thing on the subject, I hope that one of the things that I've at least tried to achieve in the book is that by spelling out principles rather than diktats of exactly how something might be done, people who read the book can feel empowered to say, okay, so these are the active ingredients that make this work, that the research suggests is probably what makes this work. Okay, how can I adapt that to my classroom? How's that going to work with this group of 6? How's this going to work with this this class of 37-year-olds or whatever it may be?
I could listen to that all day, Chris. Sorry.
You're mesmerised there.
I was genuinely starting to think about how could I do this with my class? How can I do this with my children? But it's kind of linked to that as well. Is the how to do it, because there are going to be up and down the country at the moment at this point in the year, lots of year 6 teachers and year 2 teachers in a ravel about the reading papers for the end of year stats. And I love your chapter or the chapters which link to about how you actually develop comprehension and how teaching comprehension strategies in isolation doesn't work. So I just wanted to ask you if you can not summarize the book necessarily, but just to kind of explore that myth about the awful repetitive let's teach comprehension through doing comprehension papers.
Indeed, yeah. There doesn't seem to be any decent evidence whatsoever to suggest that we can even differentiate between different kinds of questions when it comes to like answering comprehension questions, or that we can effectively target them and teach them as individual things that then supports outcomes. So that's just a little caveat, or a little thing to put to one side. I think it's absolutely the case that there is a body of evidence that suggests that teaching children that they need to be awake in a metaphorical sense, aware, alive when they're reading, to be actively constructing meaning, thinking about, well, did I understand that? Do I need to read that again? There's certainly value to teaching and modeling that stuff. And that's kind of comprehension strategies. Aside from that is this idea of comprehension skills, which seems to have become embedded in, certainly in the English education system. I know it has to an extent in the American education system as well. The idea being that, well, I need to teach children how to use vocabulary, rather than it be the case that actually, if you don't know the word, then it isn't about whether you can use it or not. You either do or don't know the word, or you have a certain amount of vocabulary depth relating to that word. Equally, inference as a skill, the idea that we can teach inference with one set of words, one context, one metaphor, say, and then children are automatically going to be more capable to infer with a completely different, in a completely different area. And again, it just doesn't really pass the smell test. It just doesn't seem to make any real sense. When we can infer, it's because we understand the words involved, the syntax of the sentence, the context that's being described. It isn't the case that we can say, well, Monday we're teaching vocabulary and Tuesday we're teaching inference and Wednesday we're teaching prediction. And the worst thing that's come from this idea of inference skills, and it's come mainly from our, you mentioned them earlier, SATs papers, so these end of primary school tests. The worst thing that's come from it is this idea of teaching individual question types, where instruction that should be the guided exploration of texts and the sharing the joy and complexity of the written English language, where that has been replaced with, okay, well, let's do a little bit of reading and then lots and lots of answering different kinds of questions. The irony being, of course, that we want to teach children how to read, and the one thing we've deprived them of is reading. And it sounds mad, but that is what seems to have happened in many schools across England, certainly, and I'm sure this is mirrored from conversations I've had with others, that it's mirrored in the United States as well.
So how do you build that comprehension of text? What are the key things that you would say to people if you want to develop really great comprehension in your class as of tomorrow? What do we need to start building?
First things first, children need to be able to decode. They need to be able to recognize the words on the page using the kind of skills that are initially introduced in phonics and that are developed through experience of text, so they can understand the kind of the wider patterns of our spelling system. So that's the first thing. I say first as in priority, not that you teach that on its own first and then wait. You can be dealing with comprehension stuff like reading beautiful books to children and developing their vocabulary from the very beginning. But in short, you must be able to decode. Beyond that, the teaching of comprehension involves, again, making sure that children become fluent readers, but it involves experience of text. It involves learning about learning new vocabulary, learning about the wider world, learning about the way that punctuation changes meaning in given texts. It's learning how syntax works, so the way that different grammatical structures in writing change meaning. But the key thing here is that there isn't really much of, as you said earlier, there aren't shortcuts here. When you are learning about a particular bit of vocabulary or a particular metaphor, you are learning that bit of vocabulary and that metaphor. You are not learning some underlying skill that allows you to work out other metaphors that you've never dealt with before. I mean, evidence of that is my partner. She is brilliantly fluent English speaker. She's originally from Slovakia. She's lived here for, I think, 14 years now. And yet there are metaphors and similes and expressions that she'll come across and be completely dumbfounded by because she just doesn't know the background to them. Now, she can read Dostoevsky, so she's fairly, I think in English, of course. So she's fluent, but this inference here isn't happening. In short, to answer your question, it's about experience with text. It's shared experience of words, text, and the wider world. And there's also a quantitative element to it as well. The last thing to say, discussion, rich discussion with children. There's a phrase I like to use is the power of the word might. The power of might. There's a massive difference when you're teaching comprehension between the question, why might the author have used this phrase, and why did the author say that? One is open to exploration. The other is, get this right, please. and trying to have these open, exploratory conversations with children about text is the way to go when it comes to teaching reading comprehension.
I love, I mean, and this is the thing, it all sounds like, it's all, you have to do it well, you have to do everything, and it is just the hard yards, is it? And sometimes I feel like this is something I kind of wrote a recent blog about this, a slight frustration I have, that when things are challenging and it's a long road, people just think, oh, it must be the wrong road, there must be another way. And it just isn't. And you have to keep teaching them loads of stuff, do loads of discussion, and that's what you're focusing on. Keep teaching the decoding. I've got so many examples of this. Like, I just could come up with so many. I had another one I wrote a little blog about, was a student in FE doing their GCSE trying to get a grade 4. So, struggling to pass the basic level for people listening from outside the UK. And reading about Muhammad Ali relinquishing his titles because he refused to fight in Vietnam. And the student didn't know who Muhammad Ali was or what Vietnam meant. And yet the teacher's decision was to focus on the meaning of the word relinquish. It was like, I was thinking, no, this is you've picked the wrong battle there, because who cares what relinquish means? It's not like, let's talk about Muhammad Ali, and Vietnam, because that's going to unlock some doors there. And that to me was just a classic. The word relinquish was lost in this fog. So that's really sort of amazing. So that means that teachers have got to just build that discussion. Now, here's the thing I want to ask you about, because this is something I talked about with some teachers today in the training I was doing. Do you think I'm right about this? My experience is this: the children who already are the most confident speakers do most of the talking in lessons, and the children who are the least confident and need the most practice get the least practice, because teachers are worried about putting them on the spot, so they don't put them on the spot, and the rich get richer in speech. Do you think that's true, or do you think I'm being mean?
No, I think that's absolutely the case. I think the difficulties of bringing out that discussion from children who are more reluctant to speak is a massive part of the skill of teaching. And it is tempting to take shortcuts and to say, okay, this child doesn't like to speak as much as others, and I respect that decision, and so I'm just going to make sure that they don't have to speak. And there are obviously circumstances where that may apply. Thinking about special educational needs, thinking about those with speech impediments, etc., etc. But as a general rule, our job as teachers is to allow children to flourish. And a big part of that is supporting them to do things that they're not initially confident doing. One of my greatest moments of pride in my NQT year was the fact that there was a young lady who did not want to be in the year 6 performance at the end of the year. And somehow I managed, or actually I say most of the work and the delicacy and of how this was dealt with was by my wonderful teaching assistant at the time. But she supported her to feel confident enough to choose to go on stage. We always left it as an option. She chose to be involved. Now, without that persistence, without that encouragement, without that nurturing, she might not have gone on stage. She might not have had that experience. She was absolutely beaming as she came off stage because she had done something that she felt beforehand was beyond her. And that's the heart of education. And so, yeah, I agree with you, and I agree that it's something that we should take seriously as educators, our responsibility to try to support children to do things that otherwise they might not feel they can do.
There is, though, with reading as well, the really important part to make the reading diet that you provide the children with so delicious and seductive they can't help but want to talk about it. And I think that there are so many missed opportunities in the teaching of reading and the inclusion of reading across the day, the week. I'm not talking about the teaching of the reading lesson or I'm talking about the diet of reading that children have in school. I think sometimes children, if they only think the diet of reading is a little tiny extract on a piece of A4 paper and some questions that go with it, why would they want to talk about it? But if you've created a world which is rich with story and narrative and interesting facts and things to read about, they're going to want to talk about what they're reading. And I just think there is often a few missed tricks in getting children to talk about their reading, because the diet that you're providing them with isn't necessarily delicious enough for them to want to get their teeth into.
100%. The number of schools that I've worked with where teachers have said, well, we usually get time to read to children at the end of the day. What do you mean usually? Because they say, well, 3 days out of 5. Do you teach maths 3 days out of 5? Because you make time for that. You've got to make time to read to your children. I mean, it's on a pragmatic level, it is teaching them vocabulary, and it is supporting their understanding of text structure and themes and genre and all that good stuff. But beyond that, it's showing them, as you say, that reading is wonderful, that reading provides them with an access to a world that they might not have access to otherwise. And so, yeah, we absolutely have to make sure that we're reading aloud to children, that reading is embedded across the curriculum, that even if we're picking a text and we're thinking, well, today we're just going to be practicing fluency, you're still thinking, they're going to love this chunk of text. There is a fascinating fact in there, like Komodo dragons, bring it on. There has to be that central idea of there's something good in this text.
Yeah.
There's something interesting to learn.
That's exactly, I was teaching year 3 yesterday. I mean, we're looking at a little extract, and I'd spent hours just looking for the perfect little extract where I thought, I've only got this X amount of time with you. I need to find something that's going to make you want to engage with this, but also potentially go and read the wider book and then more books by this author. And I think that, and I don't know how much you agree with this, Chris, that it's so important for teachers of early reading to be readers of books for early readers, to have that real understanding of what's out there that you can put in front of those children. And so I would always encourage primary teachers to read children's books, and so often that doesn't necessarily happen.
Recently we did a masterclass with Christine Council, who she was interestingly kind of like forceful about this. She was saying, she was talking about a reading curriculum in years 7 and 8 and 9, and in her trust that she's a governor of, they have this reading program, and she gave me the books and she was saying she would expect the leaders of that school to know those books, because if the children are reading them across the school, not in their English lessons, but in their sort of, in this reading aloud program. And she gave me the list. I hadn't read any of the books that she recommended for year 7, so I bought them all. I was like, and I was thinking, well, that's a fair challenge. I was thinking, so you know what? So actually, currently, I'm working my way through. I mean, I'm still on the first one. I'm reading a book called In the Sea There Are Crocodiles by Fabio Gaida, and that was her #1 choice for the beginning book to read at the start of year 7 in this program. So I'm on it. But we could talk about reading all the rest of the thing, but we don't have that much time. And I want to ask you about something else, Chris, if I can, because the truth is, the first time I ever heard about you, I didn't know you were an expert in reading. I thought you're an expert in science.
I blanch at the word expert in either case, but
because I am a science teacher, so I kind of know it. But then you'd written these schemes of learning for your school in Key Stage 2. And they just have this brilliant aspect, which is you start off by saying, well, there are a couple of things I love. One of them is at the start of each sort of new unit, it says expected prior knowledge as X, Y, Z, which is just excellent. In other words, check the children can already do this before we move on. And I recommend that to people all the time. But the second point is you develop these core ideas, like the big ideas, I think you call them in science. And they're so good. So I was thinking, like, and I still think of this now, like the #1, like for chemistry, is something like all materials are made up of building blocks that we basically just, and that is like exactly that's how we explain everything: solids, liquids and gases, chemical reactions, materials being, they're building blocks which rearrange themselves, and they're the same blocks, just in a different organ. And you've put that right in there. So if a teacher knows that, they're going to teach that so well. So that insight to me was like, Bam, that is good. So is this, do you have a background in science, or is this something from teaching it?
Yeah, my degree was in chemistry, and my master's was in biophysical environmental chemistry. Is sort of
Whoa.
it was an M-Chem, but yeah. So I've got a background in science, which helped. But I think the first thing to note is that this idea of like the big ideas of science, I think it's certainly more valuable at primary, arguably. I think it works at secondary. I think it's especially valuable at primary because these central concepts are things that we can sometimes take for granted that teachers will understand and will remember, but often they won't have done much science since GCSE science, which is often, you know, in some cases a decade or 2 decades ago. So having an understanding of those, I think, does support the development of them as science teachers, which obviously primary teachers are, as well as being English teachers and language teachers and PE teachers and everything they have to do alongside that. But just to note as well, this idea of big ideas of science, I came up with it kind of unconsciously, probably referencing someone called Win Harlan, who had big ideas of science. And I was terrified because when I found out that someone else had used the big ideas of science, I thought, oh, what if theirs are completely different to mine? So fortunately, as it turns out, there's quite a lot of overlap. So it's good news. It may well be the case that I was that I'd seen it somewhere and then it just stayed in my mind. But yeah, I do think they are useful concepts for those who are interested in that curriculum. As you say, it's available free online. It now has references to a diverse array of scientists. It has, as you say, the required understanding that's from previous topics in each topic, the vocabulary that's required. It has brief mentions of different kind of scientific careers, because I know that this is something that people have said over and over. Can you drip feed this stuff into primary so that people know that scientists aren't just people in white coats with, you know, big exciting hair like Einstein? So yeah, it's all there, but I hope it's useful to people.
It's more than helpful. It's gold. Have you seen it, Emma?
Yes, and I feel like we're having a big geek off here because my degree is a science degree as well. I'm a big science geek off. But I'm so pleased you have done it as well, Chris, because when I felt sound like a kind of long in the tooth old person now, but when they scrapped the Key Stage 2 end of Key Stage science science kind of disappeared for a while, and I'm so pleased that you've kind of put it back front and centre and made it really, really accessible, because it's been kind of the poor relation next to literacy and maths, because they retained their external assessments and science didn't. So I think that potentially people have lost their confidence with it because it hasn't been in the spotlight, and I think that resource is hugely supportive for non-specialists or for schools who really want to think about science in more depth. So thank you on behalf of everybody who's not necessarily engaged with science for a while. It's a brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. Worth noting as well, for those interested in curriculum development, that there's also partner geography and history versions as well. And dare I say, I kind of learned as I went along about curriculum development. So I think the history one is the best by a considerable distance, and the geography one's pretty good, and the science one is just it's good. I'm happy with it. But
you're trying to say you got the hang of it by the end of it?
Yeah, effectively. No, I did. I was wonderfully supported. I was sent originally, when I was trying to work out what was going on, I fairly recently joined Twitter, and a brilliant educator and an incredibly supportive person, in my experience at least, Claire Seeley, sent me some examples from her curriculum that had been created as well by a brilliant curriculum specialist called who's on Twitter as Mrs. S Teachers. And
Victoria.
yeah, sorry?
I think she's called Victoria.
Yes, I know. See, this is it. I know her first name is Victoria. I can't remember her surname, despite the fact we've had several conversations, which is pretty terrible of me. But she's wonderful. And so I received that and was able to get a bit of a head start on how a curriculum might be structured, how that might look in a PowerPoint document or whatever it might be that I used initially to kind of put ideas together. So it felt that the least I could do would be to be as generous as they had been by then saying, well, it's been built now, let's put it out into the world. In the case of the geography and history curriculum, credit where that's due as well to Fallbridge Academy, where I worked previously, because I built that almost entirely in school time. And then when I said to them, can I share this with everyone? They were like, yeah, of course, just if it helps, if you think it might help a couple of schools, I hope it's helped more than that. But if you think it can help a couple of schools, bung it online. So there wasn't even a thought of, oh, maybe we can get some money back out of that. They just had.
I'll tell you what, I just think it's amazing. If I could count on that just on that. In fact, another time we have our primary science geek out, because I just think there's so many things. Primary science is amazing. You get to grow a bean, you get to talk about dinosaurs, you get to talk about rocks and the age of the earth, and why the sun rises in the east, and all these basic ideas. It's just awesome. I love it, the whole thing. So I could get quite excited about that. But look, I would have to wrap it up, because it's like we need to. There's not enough time. It's been amazing talking to you. I just think just hearing you, I just love the commitment. There's a sincerity there, but that kind of just like absolute passion for what you're doing, and the kind of the spirit of sharing is just amazing. So I wanted to say a huge thank you, because I think what you bring and give to people is huge. And anyone who's read your amazing book, The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading, and has read your access to your website with all its free resources is, understands this. But thank you very much, Chris Such, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. May I say one more thing very briefly about the book?
Go on.
Just to say, I don't make a penny from it. All the royalties go to the Malaria Consortium. So even if you buy it and then think, oh, that was a waste of my time, you will have donated indirectly to a really wonderful cause, a GiveWell registered charity. So please, consider buying it.
Well, that's reason enough. Okay, well, look, thank you so much, Chris. Thanks to everyone listening. This is Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe, with me, Tom Sherrington, and Emma Turner.